Until very recently, when historians started to bother to tell the story of this war from the native perspective, one man was unquestionably regarded as the hero of King Philip's War, its most capable commander, its most dashing soldier. His name was Captain Benjamin Church. As an old man, Church wrote a memoir of his wartime experiences, which remains an invaluable source of information for the events that he describes. However, he may have been a bit of an unreliable narrator, as we'll later see. Church was born in Plymouth Colony and lived his whole life in the New World. In 1675, he started to build a farm on land that was owned by the Saconet Wampanoags. He chose the spot because, well, no English people had settled there yet, and he was very careful not to offend his Saconet neighbors. But in June of that year, Church's homesteading project was abruptly curtailed when men under the command of Metacomet, sachem of the Pokanoket Wampanoags and King Philip himself, attacked the town of Swansea in Plymouth Colony, kicking off King Philip's War. Governor Josiah Winslow of Plymouth called upon Church to raise a company of militiamen. That company would later go on to partake in many of the major actions of that conflict. Through the campaigns of 1675 and early 1676, which were mostly unmitigated disasters for the English, Church claims that he repeatedly urged colonial officials to adopt a new style of warfare, more suited to the thick woods and boggy swamps of southeastern New England. Though Church never missed an opportunity to emphasize how brilliant he was, not to mention brave, hardy, and handsome, there probably is some truth to this. Many of the English soldiers who marched against Metacomet in retaliation for the attack on Swansea would have been equipped in much the same way that Miles Standish was 50 years earlier, namely heavy armor. Many of them also carried pikes and obsolete matchlock muskets, while natives had long since recognized the superiority of the cutting-edge flintlock musket, which was ideal for guerrilla warfare. After the crushing English defeat at the Sudbury Fight in April 1676, Church traveled to Plymouth to again plead with colonial leaders in a meeting of the Council of War. He argued that they should give him command of an army that was no less than 300 men strong, and that it should be made up largely of allied natives. Furthermore, he said they shouldn't just hole up in a garrison or a fort and wait for Metacomet to come to them. Instead, they should hide out in the woods, like their enemy did. The council refused this proposal. A big army of 300 men, that's expensive, and Church's plan to rely on native allies made them very nervous. But in the end, Church got his way. Over the following weeks, Metacomet's forces devastated the English settlements of southeastern Massachusetts, so Church traveled again to Plymouth to see how he could make himself useful. This time, the council approved his proposal, with some slight modifications, giving him command of a large number of men, 2/3 English and 1/3 native. To hear Church tell it, he and he alone was solely responsible for implementing the tactics that turned the tide of the war. I doubt this very much, but even I have to admit that his strategies were incredibly effective. As Church and his men relentlessly pursued Metacomet across Massachusetts, his company quickly adapted to the realities of guerrilla warfare, in large part because Church actually listened to the advice that his native allies were giving him. Church writes that on one occasion, he asked some native men serving under him how they were able to get the advantage over the English when fighting in the woods. The natives replied that it was quite simple. They marched spread out through the wilderness, and when they encountered English troops, they scattered, so they always appeared to be more numerous than they were. They wore moccasins and didn't bother with heavy equipment. Instead, they relied on stealth, moving quickly and quietly through the woods in order to confuse their enemy. Whereas the English always marched in a clump and never separated or strategically retreated. Therefore, when a native force encountered an English one in the woods, they always knew how many of them they were facing. Fighting like that, it seems pretty apparent that a rapier would be as useless as a pike. Improvements in firearm technology essentially guaranteed that any clashes between Church and Metacomet would be fought primarily at long range. Melee weapons were an afterthought, and when they were used, it was probably more in accordance with the native style of hand-to-hand combat. Basically, hit and run. And this is perfect for that. It's a cutlass, a naval weapon, used for close combat on ships. Very, very simple. Basically an iron bar. And this one that I've got right here is actually way more fancy and ornate than the super stark and simple one that Church carried. You don't need to know any fancy footwork to be able to use this sword. It's a hunk of metal. You hit people with it, they die. But there's another aspect of Church's personality that we should probably discuss. So far, I may have given you the impression that he was a 17th century Han Solo, a swashbuckling blowhard, a lovable asshole. But given Church's actions toward the end of the war, I think we can safely remove the word lovable from that moniker. Don't take Church's employment of native soldiers as evidence that he was some kind of enlightened colonizer. In the summer of 1676, he forced Wampanoag captives to go seek out Wampanoags that were still resisting the English, using their families as leverage. The captives would pretend to be informing Metacomet's men about the whereabouts of English soldiers, only to go right back to Church and tell him the location of these pockets of resistance. In his memoirs, Church proudly tells the story about how he and his men captured Metacomet's wife and 9-year-old son. What he leaves out is how many leading clergymen of Plymouth, citing biblical justifications, argued that the young boy be put to death. In the end, cooler heads prevailed, and the boy was merely sold into slavery. Church portrays the last days of King Philip's War as a climactic game of cat and mouse, as he and his company tracked down and cornered Metacomet's remaining forces. Now, it's pretty much impossible to know what was going through Metacomet's mind at the time, but we do know that his army had been crippled by this point. Many of his most capable allies and captains had been slain, and he must have been racked with grief over the loss of his family. There was almost no point in killing Metacomet by the summer of 1676. The war had long since spiraled out of his control. No, I think killing Metacomet was about vengeance, certainly for the English colonists and their native allies. For Church personally, I think it was about glory. Finally, on August 12th, Benjamin Church stood over the mud-splattered body of Metacomet. He had been shot to death by one of Church's native scouts. In accordance with the English punishment for treason, Church ordered that Metacomet be posthumously drawn and quartered. His head was brought to Plymouth, and much like Wituwamat's 50 years before, it was stuck on a pole, where it remained on display for decades. But Metacomet's death isn't the climax of Church's account, not really. He then describes in gory detail how he tracked down and took prisoner Anawan, a venerable captain of the Wampanoag, who had served under Massasoit, Metacomet's father, back in the Pilgrim's Day. The night of the capture, after everyone but the 2 captains had fallen asleep, Anawan presented Church with Metacomet's own wampum belts and royal regalia. This gesture meant a lot to Church, and in his mind, signified his singular importance in saving New England from the native threat. Just take the words he puts into Anawan's mouth. "The war is ended by your means, and therefore these things belong unto you." But this chivalric scene exists in stark contrast to the broader historical reality. In the summer of 1676, hunting down natives in the woods of Massachusetts had become something of a psychopathic sport. Authorities and slave traders paid good money for captives, and these English headhunters faced very little personal danger from their desperate and starving quarry. Or look what happened that September, when the General Court of Massachusetts Bay formed a committee to decide what they should do with Native American captives who hadn't been directly implicated in violence against the English. The committee ultimately decided to sell the lot of them into Caribbean slavery. Now, to Church's mind, and to the mind of many, though not all, Puritan colonists of that era, this horrifying behavior was perfectly acceptable. But even so, it is hard to reconcile Church's murderous actions with the personal image that he so carefully cultivated for himself. The dashing frontiersman, friend to the Indians, but also an opportunistic, cruel, self-aggrandizing prick who built a career off of murdering Indians. But unlike Standish, I think Church knew exactly what kind of man he was. A cutlass. A weapon with a bright shine, but still a dirty fighter. It may take some skill to use, but at the end of the day, the idea is to bash your opponent in the fucking face as hard as you can. A nasty piece of work. Both the sword and the man.